I stayed true to my threats after my dad died. So, my dad passed away last year from cancer. And everything he owned went to my stepbrother Kevin, the house, the car, even my dad's watch that I wanted since I was 8. Kevin got it all because my stepmom Nancy made sure the will was changed right before dad got too sick to think straight. For context, Kevin's 26 and has been living off my dad for years. Never held a job longer than 3 months. Dropped out of community college twice. Spends all day playing video games in the basement. Meanwhile, I've been working since I was 15 to help pay bills when dad's construction business was struggling. Nancy always hated me because I reminded her that my dad had a life before her. She'd make little comments like, "Your real mom wouldn't have wanted you eating that much," or, "Maybe you should visit your real family more often." Whenever I tried to feel at home there, the day after the funeral, Nancy called me crying. Turns out Kevin immediately sold dad's truck to buy some crypto investment. That crashed within a week. Then he took out a loan against the house to fund his gaming stream career, which basically meant buying expensive equipment to play Call of Duty for his 12 followers. Now they were 3 months behind on mortgage payments, and Kevin had disappeared with his girlfriend to Vegas. Nancy begged me to help save the house. She kept saying, "Your dad would want you to help family, and Kevin just needs time to figure things out." I told her I'd think about it, but really, I was remembering all the times I asked for help and got nothing. Like when I needed money for senior pictures and she said they couldn't afford it. Then bought Kevin a new gaming chair the same week, or when my laptop broke junior year, and I had to handwrite all my essays while Kevin got a brand new MacBook for school that he only used for Netflix. 2 days later, Nancy called again, sobbing harder. The bank was starting foreclosure proceedings. She offered to sign over half the house to me if I'd pay off the loan. That's when I knew she was desperate. I showed up to her house with paperwork I'd printed from LegalZoom. I told her I'd pay off the entire loan and let her stay in the house, but only under certain conditions that had to be written into a contract. First, she'd pay me rent every month, exactly what I'd been paying my landlord for my tiny apartment. Second, no overnight guests without my permission. Third, she'd be responsible for all utilities, maintenance, and property taxes. Fourth, if Kevin ever stepped foot on the property again, she had 30 days to move out. And finally, she'd sign a paper admitting she manipulated my dad's will while he was sick. Nancy read through everything twice. Her hands were shaking. She kept asking if I was serious about the Kevin rule, and I reminded her that Kevin was the reason she was losing the house in the first place. She signed everything. I paid off the loan the next day. 3 weeks later, Kevin showed up drunk at 2 o'clock in the morning, banging on the door and yelling about how it was his house, and I was stealing his inheritance. Nancy tried to quietly let him sleep on the couch. I found out because my security camera sent alerts to my phone. The next morning, I showed up with a signed contract and told Nancy she had 30 days. She tried to argue that Kevin was just visiting, but the contract clearly said stepped foot on the property. She called me heartless, said I was destroying the family, asked how I could throw her out when she was grieving. I reminded her that she threw me out of my dad's life while he was dying, so now she could see how it felt to lose everything. Nancy moved in with her sister to states away. Kevin tried to call me a few times demanding I give him money since I stole his house, but I blocked his number. I kept the house and turned dad's old workshop into my own little sanctuary, a place where I could breathe without feeling the weight of everyone else's expectations pressing on my chest. I spent weeks cleaning it out, finding old tools he'd forgotten about, half-finished projects, dusty jars full of screws, things that still smelled faintly like motor oil and cedar. Being in there felt like being close to him again, like the version of him before he got sick. Before Nancy sank her claws into everything. Before Kevin turned into a walking disaster the whole family had to manage. I renovated the space slowly, repainting the walls, installing new lights, and setting up a workbench so I could finally start the furniture building hobby I've been dreaming about for years but never had the space or money for. Every board I sanded and every piece I stained felt like taking back something that had been stolen from me. Meanwhile, Nancy kept trying to guilt-trip me from afar, sending long messages about how she didn't deserve this, how Kevin was just troubled, how my dad would be disappointed in me. But I remembered every time she shut me out of decisions, every time she whispered to him that I was ungrateful or dramatic, every time she pretended I wasn't part of his real family. I ignored her messages and kept working. A month after she moved out, I started getting letters addressed to Kevin from loan companies, credit cards, even a collections agency. Apparently he'd opened several accounts using the house address and then vanished. I called each company and told them the truth, that he didn't live there anymore and hadn't for months. But every time I hung up the phone, I felt that old familiar anger boiling inside me. My dad had worked his whole life every hour of every day, breaking his back to give Kevin chances he never appreciated. And now even in death the kid was leaving messes for someone else to clean up. One afternoon, while I was installing new shelves in the workshop, a black SUV pulled into the driveway. For a second my stomach dropped because I thought Kevin had come back again. But when the door opened, a man in a suit stepped out holding a folder. He introduced himself as an attorney representing a small insurance company. My dad had taken out a private life insurance policy years ago, and never told anyone. The payout was modest, not millions or anything, but enough to make my throat tighten. According to the lawyer, the beneficiary listed was me, not Nancy, not Kevin. It felt like my dad had reached out from beyond the grave and put his hand on my shoulder, telling me he hadn't forgotten who had actually been there for him. I thanked the lawyer, closed the door, and sat on the stairs with the envelope in my hands, crying harder than I did at the funeral. A week later, Nancy somehow found out about the policy and called me screaming. She said I had manipulated my dad, that I had poisoned him against his real family, that Kevin deserved the money because he was the one who needed support. I told her that Kevin didn't need support. He needed accountability, and Dad must have known that. She threatened legal action, but since the policy was legally locked and clearly assigned, she had nothing. Then came the final blow. Kevin himself showed up again, this time sober but shaking with anger, banging on the door and demanding his share. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me so he couldn't see the security cameras recording everything. He ranted about how Dad always favored me, and how I was ruining his life. I told him calm and clear that Dad favored whoever didn't treat him like an ATM. I told him he had 30 seconds to leave before I called the police. He looked at me like he wanted to hit me, but something in my eyes must have told him I wasn't bluffing. He backed off, muttering curses as he walked down the driveway, and disappeared for good this time. Months passed and slowly the house started feeling like mine instead of theirs. I planted a garden in the backyard where Nancy used to complain about weeds. I fixed the squeaky windows Kevin always ignored. I even hung up the framed drawing I made for Dad when I was 7. The one Nancy once called childish and embarrassing. For the first time in years, the place felt peaceful. One evening, while I was finishing a coffee table I'd made from old barnwood, I caught myself smiling. Not a small smile, but a full one, the kind that makes your chest feel lighter. I realized I had finally kept the promise I made the day I discovered the will had been changed. I told myself then that I wouldn't let them walk over me, that I would fight back, that I would not let my dad's legacy be swallowed by the greed of people who didn't care about him. And I did exactly that. I stayed true to my threats, and in the end I didn't just save the house, I saved my sense of worth. Something Nancy could never take again and something Kevin was never strong enough to crush. I stood in the workshop that night with sawdust on my hands, feeling like I had rebuilt more than wood. I had rebuilt myself. Story 2 at my evaluation meeting. My wife's father, the CEO, said coldly, "We're letting you go. Performance issues." When I got home, my wife handed me a brochure for a homeless shelter and said, "Now that you're jobless, I don't need you anymore." I left silently. A week later, she and her father called me 193 times after realizing who I really was. Chapter 1: The Performance Review. I walked into the boardroom 15 minutes early, clutching my performance review folder and a coffee I barely touched. The tension in my chest wasn't from nerves. It was something colder. A shift I couldn't yet name, but felt deep in my gut. 3 years. That's how long I had worked at Sin Technologies. I started as a mid-level strategist and rose quickly, faster than most, thanks to long nights and airtight results. My wife's father, Mr. Richard Ellsworth, was the CEO, though he rarely acknowledged me outside company formalities. Our relationship was frigid at best, but I never asked for handouts. I earned my promotions on merit. Or so I thought. The conference room was glossy and sterile, mahogany table, chrome chairs, and at the head of the table sat Richard, flanked by HR and 2 board members I didn't recognize. No smiles, no greetings, just that cold nod. "Take a seat," Richard said, flipping open a file without looking at me. I sat. "We'll make this quick," he continued. "After reviewing your last quarter, we've identified a series of performance issues. Missed objectives, budget inefficiencies, lack of innovation." I blinked. "Excuse me. We're letting you go," he said, emotionless. Effective immediately. A silence hung in the air so thick it nearly choked me. I glanced toward the HR director, who avoided eye contact. One of the board members sighed, clearly uncomfortable. I opened my mouth to speak, then closed it because I realized something in that moment. This wasn't about performance. It was personal. Richard's gaze locked on mine, sharp and satisfied. "You married my daughter. That bought you some goodwill. But goodwill doesn't excuse mediocrity." He slid a termination letter across the table. "Security will escort you out." I stared at the paper. My hands didn't move. Inside, my mind wasn't screaming. It was calculating. Something subtle and irreversible had just snapped. Not because I lost my job, but because I saw the smirk behind his eyes, the smirk that said, "You were never one of us." I stood slowly, adjusted my cuffs. "Thank you for the clarity," I said, my voice steady. "I won't be needing security." I walked out without touching the letter. But I wasn't going home defeated. I was going home to face my wife and to start something they never expected. Chapter 2, The Brochure. The silence of the house greeted me when I got home that evening. Cold, hollow, and unwelcoming. For years, I'd imagined coming home to warmth, maybe a hug, maybe concern. But tonight, the air felt like it belonged to someone else. My wife Natalie sat at the kitchen island sipping wine from a glass. That probably cost more than the meal I skipped at lunch. She didn't even look up when I entered. Just say casual. "You're home early." "Yeah," I said quietly, setting down my briefcase. The company decided to restructure. That got her attention. She looked up, not with worry, but with the kind of curiosity one has when watching a stranger drop a glass. "Wait," she said, lips curling, "you got fired." I didn't answer. Her smirk widened. "I told Dad you were getting too comfortable. You should have taken his advice." My chest tightened. I wanted to ask, "You knew?" But something in her tone told me everything. She'd known. She probably helped plan it. She swirled her wine lazily, then reached into her designer tote and slid a folded brochure across the counter. "Here," she said coolly. "I figured you might need this." I unfolded it. "A local homeless shelter." She didn't blink, didn't flinch. Her words landed like ice shards. "Now that you're jobless, I don't need you anymore." There it was. The final confirmation. The years of sacrifice of carrying her through graduate school, of funding her startup ideas, the late nights, the steady loyalty, all reduced to a brochure and a smirk. I stood there staring at her, feeling the room tilt slightly, but I didn't yell. I didn't break anything. Instead, I said softly, "Thank you, Natalie. You've made things much clearer." She raised an eyebrow. "You're not going to beg?" "No," I said, my voice eerily calm. "I don't beg. I just adjust." Her laugh followed me down the hallway as I went to pack my things. "Adjust all you want, Liam. But this is our house. Don't take anything that doesn't belong to you." I paused in the doorway of our bedroom, taking one last look at the space where my life used to be. Her reflection in the mirror smiled, sharp, satisfied. But she didn't know what I was thinking. That this house never really belonged to her. That the company she and her father ran didn't either. And that the man they thought they broke was only just beginning to rise. Chapter 3, The Silence Before the Storm. I left that night with a small suitcase, and my dignity intact. No fights, no threats, no grand declarations. But in my silence, I had started a war. Natalie thought I had nowhere to go. That I was finished. What she didn't know was that I had prepared for this moment from the very beginning. 3 years ago, a hidden identity. When I married Natalie, her father insisted I work my way up in the company. He gave me a low-level role, IT support. He didn't know I was a quiet investor behind one of the tech startups Grainger Dynamics, later acquired for millions. He didn't know that I held dual degrees, one in cybersecurity, the other in finance. He didn't know I'd already sold to SaaS companies anonymously and walked away with more than $14 million before I turned 32. He thought I was a humble tech guy who married up, and that's exactly how I wanted it. The backup plan, I moved into a quiet rental the next day, paid in full for 6 months. Natalie sent no texts, no calls. She assumed I'd crawl back, that I'd beg her father for a second chance. Instead, I spent that week activating the contingency plan I drafted a year into our marriage. Call it paranoia, call it instinct, I called it survival. Unraveling their world. Step 1, freeze the joint credit cards. Step 2, revoke access to the emergency trust fund Natalie didn't know I had set up in my name only. Step 3, begin slowly offloading my silent shares in Grainger Dynamics. The ones I held through a private shell company registered in Singapore. Because here's what Richard Grainger never realized. When his company acquired Courses AI, that tiny startup of cutting threat detection tech, he thought he scored a cheap win. He didn't know the creator and majority stakeholder was me. And he signed over 12% of Grainger Dynamics to me without blinking. The phone begins to ring. On the 7th day of my disappearance, my phone buzzed. It was Natalie, then Richard. Then both again and again. 193 missed calls by the end of the day because someone from the board had discovered the true owner of the now vacant shares being sold. And that person had just refused to renew the licensing rights. That powered Grainger's newest government contract. Millions were at stake. Natalie's voice trembled on the voicemail. "Liam, please, we need to talk." But I didn't respond. Not yet, I wasn't done. Chapter 4, The Boardroom Betrayal. By the time Richard Grainger realized what was happening, it was already too late. He stormed into the boardroom at Granger Dynamics like a man possessed, red-faced, shouting into his phone, flanked by a few of his yes-men, the same ones who used to snicker behind my back. But this time, they weren't laughing because the name on the schedule that morning, the name that had every shareholder seated promptly at 9 a.m. was mine. Liam Carter, listed as primary stakeholder and former strategic director of Courses AI. And I wasn't there to ask for anything, Mr. Granger. You're in my seat. I stood at the head of the table, calm, press suit, folder in hand. Richard froze as if he'd seen a ghost. The board looked between us, confused. Until one of the older members, Catherine Lell, cleared her throat. Richard, the shares he sold back were Class B, the Class A voting shares. Still active. And majority held. His jaw dropped because he finally understood. While he had focused on numbers and titles, I had focused on leverage. He fired the man who could dismantle his company with a signature. The first move. I opened the folder. Item 1, I began, sliding a document across the table. Granger Dynamics dependency on Courses threat detection software exceeds 70%. As of midnight, that license expired. Gasps filled the room. Item 2. Richard Granger failed to disclose that his daughter Natalie directly profited from the illegal repackaging and resale of proprietary software code. I snapped toward him. Natalie had been skimming profits from side contracts, all routed through dummy accounts. Evidence already sent to the board and sealed emails. No more masks. Richard's voice cracked. You used us. I smiled, finally letting it show. You used me first. Dismissed me, mocked me, replaced me. I leaned forward. I didn't lose control. I gave it up just long enough to see how far you'd fall on your own. The board called a vote. Within 15 minutes, Richard Granger was suspended pending investigation. The same day, Natalie was served with a subpoena for digital fraud and breach of intellectual property. And me? I was offered the role of Chief Technology Officer. I declined. I didn't come back to run your company. I came to remind you who built its future, while you were too busy trying to erase mine. Chapter 5. The price of betrayal. The news spread like wildfire. Granger Dynamics stock plummeted within 48 hours of the board meeting. Tech forums and business news outlets began piecing together the puzzle. A massive internal fraud scheme, expired licenses, and a public power shift that left industry veterans stunned. But nothing was more brutal than what came next. Not in boardrooms or headlines, but in the quiet fallout that tore personal lives apart. Natalie's fall from grace. Natalie's social media, once a gallery of curated luxury, vanished overnight. Sponsors dropped her. Friends distanced themselves. Her influencer deals dried up like spilled perfume. Even her mother, who had once proudly paraded her as a Granger Aries, refused to answer her calls. Then came the civil lawsuit filed by shareholders who had unknowingly invested. During the peak of her financial misconduct, she reached out to me through a private message. Liam, please tell them I wasn't the only one. I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't respond. Because it wasn't just about her choices. It was about how easily she discarded the man who had built a life beside her. Richard's legacy dismantled. The Granger name, once synonymous with prestige, became a case study in corporate arrogance. Richard tried to spin it as a misunderstanding. But the digital trail was undeniable. And in a final act of poetic justice, the Department of Justice opened a formal investigation into past government contracts awarded to Granger Dynamics during Richard's tenure. Contracts I had originally negotiated. Turns out they'd altered vendor records after I left. A federal audit was the nail in the coffin. My final move. I donated a portion of my settlement from the shareholder litigation to a scholarship fund. One focused on helping first-generation engineers and programmers. The fund was named after someone who had always believed in me. The Thomas Carter Initiative, after my late father, a carpenter who never learned to code, but always told me I could build anything. I didn't need the fame, the credit, or the revenge to be loud. I just needed it to be complete. Natalie's message weeks later, a voicemail tearful and cracked. You never yelled. You never hit back. You just vanished. And that hurts more than anything. You were the real one, Liam. I see that now. I wish I had seen it before everything fell apart. I sat in my new office, not at Granger Dynamics, but in a small startup I quietly invested in years ago. A place where the people were humble, the mission was real, and my name actually mattered. I didn't call back. Some lessons aren't meant to be shared. They're meant to be felt. Epilogue: the power of quiet revenge. There's a strange kind of silence that follows a storm, not a peace, but of realization. Natalie and Richard had built their identities on appearances, polished dinners, luxury brands, boardroom prestige, and the illusion of control. They believed power came from dominance, from stepping on others to elevate themselves. But what they never understood is that real power doesn't scream, it plans. What they lost. Natalie now works a mid-level job at a digital marketing firm, trying to rebuild a reputation that was shattered by betrayal and scandal. She drives a used sedan and rents a modest apartment, a far cry from her designer penthouse days. Richard retired early, not by choice. His name now lives on illegal case studies, a cautionary tale, and MBA ethics courses. His so-called legacy erased with every new article about his corporate downfall. Their social circle gone. Their influence vaporized. Their pride turned to ash. What I gained? I didn't just regain my career. I reclaimed my dignity. I now mentor young engineers, invest in ethical startups, and quietly fund community tech programs that help underserved youth break into the world of innovation. I found purpose, not just profit. And most of all, I found peace in knowing I never had to become cruel to win. The lesson: if someone tries to dim your light so theirs shines brighter, let them. Then build a bonfire with every bridge they burned and let them watch from the cold. Because nothing haunts the selfish more than watching the one they betrayed thrive without them. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying someone. It's letting them destroy themselves while you rise. And rise I did. Was this revenge perfectly justified, or should the storm have raged harder? Drop your verdict below. I read every single one. Hit like if you crave justice and share the story with someone who needs its fire. Subscribe to Revenge Exposed, because here betrayals don't sleep. They hunt their owners. Every shadow hides a reckoning. Every mask breaks and every betrayal is answered. Stay sharp. Stay unbroken. Stay tuned.